When the fire finally stopped, all that was left were bones stacked on top of each other, like the people had died hugging, like they were ready. It's like they knew. But here's what haunts everyone who stood in Kanungu that day. Nobody had screaming, no banging on the doors, no cries for help. It was too quiet, just silence. Well, until the roof caved in. They called it a cult. They said the believers chose this fate, but some whisper a darker truth. Some say those people were murdered. This isn't just a story about a church fire. Not at all. This right here is a story about a movement that began with whispers of salvation and ended with over 900 bodies. It's a story about a prophet who lost his way and a woman who some feared more than death itself. It's about the children who didn't know why they were there. They just went with their parents, They don't know why they were there. And it's also about families who said goodbye in the morning and never saw their loved ones again. And it's about a mystery that lingers decades later with no one held accountable. Before we dive into this darkness, a warning. This case contains disturbing real-life details, mass death, cult activity, spiritual manipulation. It may be triggering, especially for sensitive viewers. My goal with Beneath the Rift is to uncover Africa's darkest crimes, not to glorify them. It's to understand what happened, why it happened, and how it scarred real people. Some elements touch on African spiritual beliefs, mysteries science can't fully explain. These are shared with respect as part of the story's cultural heart. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to Beneath the Rift, where we explore Africa's darkest mysteries, crimes, and the shadows in between. I'm your host, Rose Basemura. I'll be your guide through stories that haunt, stories that linger, stories that demand to be told. They called it the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. I hope you all know the 10 Commandments of God, right? I don't have to go through them. But what was restored? What they restored wasn't that. It was terror. And that terror still haunts people up to date. And that's 20 years later, 25 years later. But anyway, let's step back. Way back, before the flames, before the silence, and before Kanungu became a name that chilled hearts. This story doesn't start with a church fire. It doesn't start with a church burning. It starts with two people, two lives that collided in a way no one could have predicted. A man who had everything and lost it, and a woman who had nothing but wanted everything. Let's begin with that woman, Credonia Mwerinde. But when I made my research, I found out that they used to pronounce her name as Credonia. So from now on, I'm going to be referring to Credonia Mwerinde as Credonia. So Credonia was born in 1952 in Katete, Nyabugoto, deep in Kanungu's hills. This isn't just any village. It was a land of whispers, of spirits, of stories older than the roads. Her father, Paolo Kashaku, was a farmer. But he was more than that. He saw things others didn't. And in 1960, he claimed his dead daughter, Evangelista, appeared to him, like speaking of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, Saint Joseph, etc. Imagine growing up with that. A father who believed he touched the divine. Those visions weren't just stories. they were power. And Caledonia, she learned from them. Speaking of Kanungu, Kanungu wasn't just a farm area, a farmland. Nearby were the Nyabugoto caves, sacred to the Nyabingi priestesses. These Nyabingi priestesses fought colonial rule with rituals and rebellion. So those caves were held, like those caves held weight. They were where the living met the unseen. And Caledonia, even as a girl, knew their pull. But life wasn't kind. By the 1980s, Caledonia was fighting to survive in Kanungu. She brewed banana beer. In local language, I think that's what they call Mwenge Bigede, if I'm not mistaken. And she also sold liquor and ran a small shop. This and that, these things I've mentioned above were her trade. But the money dried up. The shop failed, and the locals turned their back. Some whispered she was trouble. Even her own husband, Eric Mazima, said the worst about her. He called her a prostitute. But we can't say what the truth is yet fully, because that's what he said, and they had their things going. Not a good breakup. Let's just say Caledonia was alone, scraping by with no way out. And then something happened. Something changed. In 1981, Caledonia said the Virgin Mary appeared to her. A vision, clear as day. And it happened again 7 years later in 1988. In those Nyabugoto caves I mentioned earlier, she said she saw Mary's face, Virgin Mary's face on a rock. Imagine you're her. Your life's failing, like your life's falling apart. I mean, no money, no respect, no husband anymore. And then the Virgin Mary chooses you. What do? Caledonia chose to listen. Caledonia wasn't just a prophet. She was a master manipulator. Because locals said her stare could freeze you, like she saw your every fear. She'd whisper promises of salvation, but if you doubted her, her voice turned sharp, warning of eternal punishment. Survivors later said she'd isolate followers, cutting them off from family, making them feel only she could save them. Even her own husband felt her darkness. Eric Mazima, the man she left behind, had this to say.
Bamukwata bamubuze cyatumire nita abantu nico cyokuba sikiri akaba se bamukwata bamubuze cyatumire nita abantu abo kuba nyowe ecyakere doti wanje takiri nanye mu mutima gwanye ndo kuruga kare nkamurugo kare na yafa ni kinshemeza abo kuba sisira abantu.
Mazima's words echo the fear Caledonia inspired, a woman who could charm a village or destroy it. She wasn't just a brewer anymore. She was a prophet. And she was hungry. Not for food, but for power, for purpose. Locals said she had a way with words, a charm that could pull you in, or a whole 180, scare you cold. They called it malign charisma. So think about it in the 1980s and 90s, in a Uganda torn by war, AIDS, and chaos. People were desperate for something and someone to believe in. But Caledonia knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed someone with weight, someone with respect, someone that people would trust. And that's when she found him, Joseph Chibwetere. Second person you're going to look at, the man who had everything but lost it all. Joseph was born in 1932 in Ntungamo. It's a few hours from Kanungu. His world was different. He came from a devout Catholic family, rich by Ugandan standards, with land, cattle, influence. So faith, you look at this picture, faith wasn't just part of his life. It was his life. I'm talking groceries, icons, prayers, all that filled his home. Joseph was a man people looked up to. I'm going to list him things right now. He was a primary school teacher, an assistant supervisor of schools for the Mbarara Catholic Diocese. He ran his own private Catholic school and built churches on his land. In 1960, he married Teresa, who was a teacher herself. You know, they met in the same line of work, which is really common and sweet at that moment. And they had 8 kids. He was the kind of man you'd see at Mass every Sunday, leading hymns, like he was always there, guaranteed, never missed a Sunday, not even one. But Joseph had secrets. He had children outside his marriage, like a quiet scandal for a holy man. And in the 1980s, things unraveled. He ran for office in 1980 in Ankole, dreaming of power. Oopsie. But he lost. Then his farm took a hit. Someone, well, nobody knows who, poisoned 80 of his cows. 80! Do you know how much a cow costs? That's a fortune in rural Uganda. I'm talking not even just rural Uganda, even in urban Uganda. That's a lot of money. So his wealth, his pride, they were slipping away. And then in 1984, Joseph said something that changed everything. He claimed he saw the Virgin Mary, a vision right there in Ntungamo. This wasn't new in Uganda, by the way. Everyone was claiming to see things at that time. Like visions were spreading, people hungry for hope after Idi Amin's terror and Obote's wars. But Joseph, it wasn't about all those things. It was something personal. He had been to Rome in 1979, got a papal blessing. And they said he had this obsession with Mary, with miracles. I don't know if it's because he was called Joseph and he had an obsession with Mary. Who knows? Some say he was struggling, maybe with his health, maybe with his heart. There's a talk he was treated for bipolar disorder, but we don't have proof, and I'm not here to guess. So, what we do know about Joseph is Joseph was at a crossroad, right? His world was cracking, and he was ready to believe in anything, in something bigger. Joseph wasn't just a devout man. He was a man breaking apart. Friends said he'd grown erratic by the late 80s, talking of visions non-stop, neglecting his family. Some whispered he had voices beyond Mary's, voices that drove him deeper into Credonia's orbit. Was he a believer or a man lost to his own mind? And that's when Credonia walked into his life. It was the 80s was like a hard hit for both their lives. So picture this. Joseph was at a church service in Nyamitanga, praying like he always did. Like I told you, he was at church every Sunday. And then there she was, Credonia Mwerinde, with 2 women, Ursula Komohanji and maybe Angelina Mugisha. They approached him, bold as anything. Credonia looked him in the eye and said the Virgin Mary had spoken to her. She said Mary told her to find Joseph Chibwetere, that he was chosen, that they were meant to save souls, to restore God's law. So we are going into this state again. Imagine you're Joseph. You've lost so much. Your farm, your dreams, and you've seen the Virgin Mary before yourself, right? Like years ago. And now this woman with fire in her eyes says she's seen her too. And she says you're part of something holy. What do you do? So, just like Credonia, Joseph let her in. Not just into his life, into his home. Credonia moved into his house in Kabumba, Ntungamo, with her followers. But his wife Teresa wasn't so happy about it. She said Credonia was trouble. She said she even set her clothes on fire once. allegedly. But Joseph, who was all in, he believed in Caledonia's visions. He said her visions matched his own. He believed they were called to do something extraordinary. And by late 1989, they'd started something new. And you know what it was called? I said it before. They called it the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God. It wasn't just a church. It was a promise that the world was ending and that only the pure would survive. Caledonia was the voice, the programmer, the one who saw the future. Joseph was the face, the respected man who gave it legitimacy. And together, they built a following, drawing in people desperate for salvation in a Uganda that was so scarred by loss and war. But nobody could have known back then. That movement that was born from visions and faith, it was the first spark of fire that would consume everything. Now let's meet the people who followed the spark, the ones who believed Caledonia and Joseph's promises, the ones who paid the ultimate price. You know, most of the people who joined the movement were ordinary Ugandans. Farmers with scarred hands, mothers who prayed for their children's futures, and kids who just followed their parents because, of course, they're kids. Where your parent goes, you go. They weren't rich, they weren't powerful. They were people like you and me. There were people who were searching for hope in a world that felt like it was breaking. They gave up everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. They gave up land, livestock, possessions. Some even cut ties with their families. Like, they believed they'll be reborn in a new world. But life in the movement wasn't just devotion. It was control. Followers took vows of silence and only spoke when they were allowed to. They fasted for days, gave up all their possessions, even their voices. Children were separated from their parents and taught only to obey Caledonia's every word. It wasn't a church. It was a prison dressed in prayers.
Okukora munonga nicyo cyatumire narugamo no kuzibera mu mutaterana n'abakazi no kushoma munonga amashuga koboka no kugira umusande biro bishatu byo bibiri byo kusiba kwe urwo kubazana n'urwa katanu ukara wabona bana bakora nk'umuhuku.
The movement taught them that the world was coming to an end on December 31st, 1999. That belief was around the world. I don't know, they thought the world wouldn't get into 2000. And they said only the faithful, the ones who follow the 10 commandments of God to the T, would be saved. But when midnight struck and the world didn't end, something shifted. And people were like, oh, I want my land back. I want my money back. And then Caledonia stepped forward with a new prophecy. She said the Virgin Mary had given them more time. And the end was still near. And it was now ending on March 17, 2000. That was the day. And this time, the preparation was different. Some followers wrote farewell letters, saying goodbye to their loved ones, like the ones that left behind who did come with them. Others sent their children into the Kanungu compound, trusting they'll be safe with the movement. One mother, her name lost to history, wrote, "We got to meet Mary in the sky." Just thinking about it is... Can you imagine that? Believing so deeply, you'd send your child into the unknown. They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know the truth. And that would... One family, the Muhwezis, lost 3 generations that day. Anna Muhwezi, a grandmother, brought her daughter and 2 grandchildren to Kanungu, believing Credonia's promise of heaven. Their farewell letter, found later, read, "We go to God with joy." Their trust? It really breaks your heart. So, Uganda in 2000 was a nation scarred. Idi Amin's terror, Obote's wars, and AIDS had torn families apart. People were desperate for hope, for a savior. The movement preyed on that pain, offering a new world when the old one felt broken. That desperation, it was the crack they fell through. March 17, 2000, in Kanungu, Uganda. The sun rose like any other day, of course, but in the movement's compound, over 530 people gathered in a church made of wood and hope. They sang hymns, their voices rising to the heavens. They danced, praising the salvation they believed was hours away. Oh, of course they feasted. They ate. They ate like as a whole together, final meal kind of thing. A feast of roasted meat and Coca-Cola. It was bought in bulk by the leaders. It really felt like a celebration, like I said, a feast. But there were signs. Signs nobody saw or maybe didn't want to see. Number 1, the windows had been boarded up days before, nails driven deep. Fuel cans, jerry cans full of petrol had been smuggled in, hidden in the shadows. And the doors, they were closed. I mean, shut from the outside. Locked from the outside. So it's not like everyone is in a church. Who locked the doors? Who knows? We'll get to that. But then at around 10:30 a.m., it began. A spark. A flame. Nobody knows who lit it. But within minutes, the church was an inferno. And then witnesses in the nearby villages said they heard nothing at first. Just a strange silence, heavy over the hills. But others, those who were closer to the compound, they told a different story. They had faint cries, children's voices calling out, screams swallowed by the roar of fire. Panic, trapped inside those walls. By the time anyone could act, it was too late. The church had collapsed like into a smoldering rubble. Bodies were found pilings, like the bodies were found in piles. Some were embracing, like, tight hug, like I said earlier, like they were hugging each other. Some were clutching like hymn books, Others were holding onto the bottles because some of them went with like the soda bottles inside the church. But they didn't stand a chance. And we still agree that this wasn't an accident. This was a mass murder. And then the horror deepened. If you think this is bad, wait till you hear this. This church that burned down, wasn't the only grave. Days later, during investigations, like of course the investigators searched other movement properties, places the cult had called home. In Buhinga village, they found a pit with like 153 bodies. In Rogazi, under a priest's house, they found 155 more bodies. In Rushogwa, 81. In Buziga in Kampala, they found 55. Some were poisoned, others strangled, hacked, clubbed, name it. The death toll climbed. 700, 800, 900, maybe over 1,000. Nobody knows for sure because ashes can't talk. This wasn't a single fire. This was a slaughter planned across months, maybe years. Who knows? When the smoke finally cleared, Uganda was still in shock. Police swarmed Kanungu, trying to piece together a nightmare. But the more they dug, the worse it got. Investigators found evidence of planning. The fuel cans weren't a last-minute choice. They'd been bought weeks before. They boarded windows like nails driven deep. They nailed the doors as well. It was deliberate. And those mass graves, they weren't fresh. Somebody's had been there for months, maybe even longer. Hidden while the movement preached salvation. It's something like you speak against the movement and they say you're going to die, predict death, you disappear. Probably allegedly, they killed those people and hid them all those places. And the death toll keeps rising, 1,000 more. And the leaders, Joseph Chiwetere, Credonia Mwerinde, Dominic Kataribabo, and Ursula Komohanji, Angela Mugisha, gone. They were gone. Not a trace. No bodies identified as theirs in the rubble. And police suspected they'd faked their deaths, slipped away before the fire, and then someone lit the fire. Of course, the match was outside. One of them might have done it. The police were out of their depth. Reports sat ignored for years. Complaints of missing children, stolen land, and some said that the local officials were bribed and looked the other way. One officer even admitted that they didn't act because the movement seemed holy. That blindness, it let a massacre unfold. Some said they had fled Uganda, maybe to Kenya, Rwanda, Malawi, who knows? Because in 2014, police got a tip that Chiwetere was hiding in Malawi. Well, nothing came of it, unfortunately. I didn't talk about the other 2 to 3 people that I mentioned. I only talked mainly about Credonia and Joseph. Now let's talk about the other leaders for a moment. Ursula Komohanji, Credonia's sister. She was the logistics mastermind, handling money, supplies, maybe the fuel, who knows. And then you have Dominic Kataribabo, a defrocked Catholic priest. He was the enforcer, a man who traded his collar for control. And together, they built a machine, organized, ruthless, hidden behind prayers. But the question everyone asked was, who gave the order? Was it Chiwetere, the prophet who'd lost his way, or Credonia, the woman who seemed to hold the cult in her grip, like boss lady I'm talking? As the investigations told, Kanungu filled with whispers, rumors that painted a cult darker than anyone imagined. Villagers spoke of strange rituals in the forest near the compound, believers forced to kneel for hours, beaten if they questioned the leaders. Some said Credonia kept a list. True believers on one side, betrayers on the other. Those who doubted didn't last long. One story chilled me to the bone. A survivor, a man who left before the fire. He said like Credonia could predict death. She'd point at someone and say, "You won't see the new world." And days later, they'd be gone. So, was it fear, coincidence, or something else? Well, if you ask me, those are the bodies that were found in the other, areas that belong to the church. Those are the bodies. That's where those people went. And then there is Chiwetere's family. His wife Teresa and son Juvenal spoke out after the massacre. They said Joseph wasn't the man they knew anymore. Because after Credonia came into his life, he changed. Distant, obsessed, like he was under a spell. Teresa said Credonia wasn't just a prophet. She was a force, like someone who could bend people to her will. But here's where it gets messy. Some said the movement wasn't even about faith, that it was a scam, a way to fleece desperate people out of their money, their land, everything. The cult collected donations, sold believers property, and even promised a trip to Europe to see the Noah's Ark. Is there a Noah's Ark in Europe? If there is, please tell me in the comment section below, because I don't know about that. Is it there? But the question still stands, where did the money go? Nobody knows, because the leaders vanished with it. And yet, every lead went cold. Police found papers, letters, a manifesto called A Timely Message from Heaven. Ta-dam! It spoke of the end of times, of Mary's warnings, but it didn't explain the fire. It didn't explain the graves. What was going on behind closed doors? In Kanungu, the massacre wasn't just a crime. It was a mystery that felt otherworldly, because the villagers swore Caledonia had powers, not just charisma, but something deeper. They said she could look into your soul, control your thoughts, and make you do things. They said that her visions of the Virgin Mary weren't just dreams. They were real. Some believed she spoke to the Virgin Mary every night, getting orders for the movement. And then there were stories from that day, like I'm talking that day of March 17th, 2000. People in Kanungu said, allegedly, that when the church burned, the birds stopped singing. It's like the sky turned gray, not from smoke, but from something unnatural. One elder said, it was just like the world held its breath, like a But the strangest claim, it came from a man who should have been there, a follower who arrived too late, arrived just as the flames died down. And he said, oh, the fire wasn't normal. It moved too fast, with no smoke, like it was guided. Isn't that the petrol lines it's following? Anyway, he swore he saw shapes in the flames, figures that weren't human. Was he grieving, imagining things, or did he see something we can't explain? But not to judge, let me say this. These stories weren't just traumas. They are part of Kanungu's soul, part of how people made sense of a horror too big to grasp at that time. The Nyabugoto caves weren't just rocks. They were Nyabingi's heart, where priestesses once channeled spirits to fight invaders. And Credonia tapped into that power, blending it with Catholic visions of Mary crying blood. And in Uganda, where faith and spirits intertwine, her followers didn't question, they believed. In Uganda, faith and mystery aren't separate. They are woven together. And the movement, it thrived on that. So, months after the fire, the truth started to emerge. It wasn't a mass suicide. It wasn't that like some people first thought. This was a mass murder. Planned, coordinated, cold. Because think about this, guys. Let's list them things out. Number one, the doors were nailed shut. Number two, fuel was planted weeks in advance. And the mass graves held bodies killed long before the fire. Some poisoned, some strangled. And the leaders, they weren't among the dead. They'd vanished. They'd vanished, leaving their followers to burn. So investigators found torture pits, places where believers were punished, maybe even killed for doubting the movement. You say bring back my money after the world it end on like December 1999, you vanish. Under our leader's house, it held children's remains. Children who trusted their parents, their prophets, to keep them safe. So I feel like this wasn't just faith gone wrong. This was a betrayal, a cult built on lies, on fear, on control. And to this day, not a single person has been prosecuted. 25 years later. When the fires died, Kanungu was left in pieces. Families stood by that church waiting for answers that never came. All they got were bonds. And the Ugandan government? The Ugandan government launched an investigation too late. But even up to now, Uganda responds to things late. Accidents on the road, it still happens when they respond to anything very late. And sometimes time is crucial. Well, a judicial commission was promised. It was led by Justice Augustus Kania, but it never met. Parliament looked into it. The Human Rights Commission wrote a report, pointing fingers at local officials who ignored warnings. It was like, whose fault? Who am I blaming? It was like now a blame game. Nothing changed out of that anyway. No arrests, no justice. Locals were shattered. Survivors like Judith Ariho and Anna Kabeireho couldn't eat meat for months because of that stench. Like, they were haunted by the smell of burnt flesh. Communities were torn apart because of the blaming game, blaming each other, blaming themselves. Some said the movement's land was cursed, that spirits lingered there. Well, today the church site is a tea plantation. Mass grave sits unmarked, just a mound of soil. There's a businessman, Benon Biarohanga, said he wants to build a memorial. But as of now, it's just a dream. Even now, Kanungu's pain lives on in stories that refuse to fade. In 2018, Ugandan filmmaker Bart Kakoza brought the massacre to life in a film called The World is Ending Tomorrow. Shot in the local Ruchiga language, it's a raw 3-hour journey into the cult's final days. A young man racing to save his cousin from the flames, only to face the horror of what happened. Kakoza, a Catholic himself, wanted to set the record straight. This wasn't suicide, but murder. His film is a cry for remembrance, proof that Uganda's artists are still wrestling with this crimson crack in their history. And the nation's leaders felt that pain too. Uganda's vice president at that time, Specioza Wandira Kaziwe, spoke out in 2000, grappling with the loss.
Government is going to do all it can to put the leaders of this cult to book. Otherwise, what other consolation can you give to a people when they lose their relatives?
Kaziwe's words promised justice, but for Kanungu's families, they were just that, words. No one was held accountable. Families pray in silence. They light candles, hoping their loved ones found peace. But the pain, it never left. On April 6, 2000, arrest warrants went out. I'm talking international ones through Interpol. So there are people that were on that list. Teredonia Mwerinde, Joseph Chibwetere, Dominic Kataribabo, Ursula Komuhanji, and Angelina Mugisha. They were wanted for murder, for betrayal, for 900 lives lost. But they were gone. Even local officials were left in the dark. Bakandema William, Kanungu's district information officer shared this in 2000.
The leader of this cult, who is called Joseph Chibwetere, we don't know up to now where he is. Because even some of his family members were saying that he had come this end, and previously there were reports that he had gone to Nairobi hospital for treatment. So up to now, we don't know where he is.
25 years later, they are still gone. Chibwetere was rumored to be in Malawi, maybe in Kenya, maybe in Rwanda. Remember 2014, police thought they had a lead, but it vanished like smoke. Some say he died in the fire, others say he's still out there hiding. The guy was born in the 1930s. Maybe he's no longer alive. Maybe. Even though he survived the fire, might have died. Who knows? I'm just saying. And Caledonia, she's a ghost. Some swear she died in Kanungu. Others whisper she's alive, moving through shadows, a myth that won't die. So, no trials, no sentences, no justice, just silence. The movement's compounds were looted, abandoned, left to rot. Of course, as anything else, the world moved on, but Kanungu didn't. Because there are very many questions that linger over Kanungu, like smoke that never clears. I mean, how could nearly 1,000 people die and no one be held responsible? Why didn't anyone stop it when the signs were there? They said warnings were ignored. Because doing research, I found out that warnings came as early as 1994. This is 6 years before that 2000 thing. There are complaints about like children being kidnapped or like forced donations. In 1999, a woman begged the Human Rights Commission to save her kids. They died in the fire. Local officials like RDC Kitaka Gawera even laid the movement's foundation stone. Imagine. Was it ignorance, corruption, or something darker? And who really led the movement? Aren't you curious? Was it Joseph Chibwetere, the prophet broken by loss, or Caledonia Mwerinde, the woman who seemed to hold life and death in her hands? Some say she was the mastermind, using visions to control, to destroy. Others say they both believed, truly believed the end of the world was coming. And what about these visions? The Virgin Mary, the tears of blood, the fire that moved like it had a mind of its own. Were they lies? Delusions? Or did something beyond our understanding touch Kanungu that day? If I'm to put my 2 cents on this, I would say sometimes people are troubled in a way that, you know how they say you can tell too many lies that you start believing in the lie yourself, like you lie to yourself as well. It can also happen like Credonia and Joseph maybe lied a lot, and because they had everything going wrong in their lives, wanted that something to believe in, that they believed so hard and also fell for their own lies. That could also be it. That's just my 2 cents on it. Anyway, I digress. We just may never know because no one is there to answer our questions. This mystery, it lives on. They came to a church that morning believing in salvation, and what they got was silence, fire, and an ending they didn't see coming. This was the Kanungu Massacre. Thank you very much for joining me in the shadows of Beneath the Rift. This is just the beginning. Next time, we head to South Africa to meet a survivor haunted by the Tokoloshi, a spirit that drove men to kill and left a trail of bodies behind. Until then, stay curious. And if you know stories like this from your community, let's hear them. Comment below or email us. This is Rose Basemra. Bye.